So the very act of creating is emulating an attribute of our God. When we create, we are in essence worshiping our God with our gifts. That's where we come from, and I think is so important for Christian schools to have this as part of their curriculum.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
It's time for another episode, and today we are talking fine arts in Christian schools. A few months back, we had an episode or two on athletics, and we talked then about the varying views of athletics in Christian schools, and with that, about the role of athletics as well as its impact. I really feel like fine arts has some similarities there as well. Some schools have it, some schools don't, some struggle, some overemphasize it, but in spite of that, fine arts is a powerful tool in a Christian school. I personally grew up in athletics, but I also grew up in fine arts programs, and I am so grateful for those who poured into those programs so I could have those opportunities. We have a fantastic conversation ahead of us today. Listeners, welcome. I am confident you're going to be glad you've taken time to listen in today. Just before we get talking fine arts, a quick reminder to take a minute to subscribe to this podcast. If you have friends who aren't listening in, please share this podcast with them as well. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Teacher Edition Pod. Those of you who are listening, don't forget you can also watch these interviews on YouTube as well as Teacher Edition Podcast. And lastly, we are really enjoying taking your questions. So take a minute now and think of something that you would like to ask. Then go hop onto our website, teachereditionpodcast.com. There you can subscribe to our emails, but you can also submit your questions. The possibilities are endless, so no matter what grade or what subject you are, send those in, and we look forward to sharing them on the show. I want to park there for just a second. I haven't done this in a while, so indulge me for just a minute. I know as an educator, I have had so many times over the years where I just wish I could ask another educator a question, one that may even sound dumb to someone. But I just wondered, how does someone else do this? Or how would someone else handle this? There were times when I would have loved to email every educator I could think of and ask for an idea of how to solve something or just at least get me headed in the right direction. See the Teacher Edition podcast that way. Think of something you might ask at a teacher's convention or if you visited another school. What might you ask them? Now, take a minute, and literally that's all it takes. Go to our website, click to record your question, and do it. It's fast and painless. You know, if you go back to grading or decorating or vacuuming or whatever else you need to do, you won't go back to it. So pause this episode, go record your question, and I am looking forward to seeing what you submit. Okay, let's unpack today's topic. We are so privileged to have Dr. Darren Lawson with us today. Darren serves as an consultant for communication. He also works with Christian schools and homeschool groups on their fine arts programs. Darren has extensive experience in the field of fine arts, and I mean extensive. Having served as a university dean of the School of Fine Arts and Communication, Darren also oversaw the university's academic programs in art and design, music, theater, journalism, film, and communication. He was a producer for all stage productions, and he was also a frequent actor, portraying roles such as Cyrano and King Henry IV. Darren knows fine arts. I also had the privilege of knowing him and his wife for a number of years. So his wife, she's also an educator, and I actually had the opportunity then to also work for Darren for a number of years in the past. I learned a lot from Darren. I will just say, it was so interesting and so enjoyable serving under him. I had the opportunity to observe many meetings, many interactions, many situations. And honestly, I really believe the Lord used that time to prepare me for the leadership roles he was bringing my way. So I am just so grateful for the opportunity that I had to serve with Darren. Darren, it's so great to have you here today. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, Jenny. It is a great privilege to be on here with you and to see you serving God in such a great way. I've really appreciated you over the years, and it's good to connect with you today.
Well, excited to have you on. Okay, let's start with a foundation. There's a lot of variety and thought about fine arts, specifically as it relates to biblical worldview and maybe more broadly faith. So let's start there. What are your thoughts on how a fine arts program in a Christian school effectively integrates faith and artistic expression? What do you think?
Yeah, so I always start with a macro look at this, and I tell folks that we are serving a creator God. And we are made in the image of God. So therefore, we each have creative potential as part of who we are. So the very act of creating is emulating an attribute of our God. So when we create, we are in essence worshiping our God with our gifts. That's where we come from, and I think is so important for Christian schools to have this as part of their curriculum. And so that's kind of where the integration of faith and artistic expression come from in my view.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so fine arts programs come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some define the school, while others struggle to even get it off the ground. At the same time, I would say that I don't know how to say it, some have depth and some tend to never really get past that surface level of the arts. I don't know. That's not a good way to describe it, but hopefully you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Darren, in your experience, what are some characteristics of schools that have successful art programs? What are you seeing?
Sure. And I've worked, Jenny, with dozens of schools across the United States, and I've found that the most successful programs are kind of on a three-legged stool. The first leg of that stool is solid academics, which is just a non-negotiable. The second, and you mentioned this before, and it's a robust athletic program. And the third leg is a strong fine arts program. Now, I came from a school that I did both. I played athletics, I did basketball, I played baseball for a year, but then I was involved in everything fine arts that we did. So I think schools need to have all three of those things. And I'm a fine arts guy saying you need to have an athletics program as well, because I saw how it impacted me and impacted my son. And then I think we have to look at the fine arts as it's a component of experiential learning. We take what we're getting in the classroom, and then we allow the students to put much of that into practice up on stage. And so, to me, it's a win-win because it's an extension of the academics in the classroom.
I like how you brought that package together because often we feel like athletics fights fine arts. It's like, well, you can't have a game then because we have a practice or we have a play that night or whatever.
Yeah.
And they tend to butt heads sometimes. But I love how you brought that as a good package for strength in a school.
Absolutely.
So this podcast is obviously for Christian educators. We focus a lot on scripture and on biblical worldview. But what about fine arts and the Bible? As you as a Christian intersect with fine arts on a daily basis, are there Bible stories or teachings, maybe specific teachings that you find particularly relevant to fine arts education?
Well, I mean, if you look at scripture, Jenny, it is an inspired story on a macro level. God, he chose to impart his truth through the Holy Scriptures, and it's a story about his redemptive work with mankind. So if you look at it from a macro perspective, God chose storytelling to give us the gospel gift. Second, I looked throughout Scripture, and I taught this for many years as well, but I just pulled out a few examples. Number one, the Psalms. They are filled with encouragement to sing, to play instruments, to choose different art forms as praise and worship. Then in Exodus, we discover that men were filled with the Spirit to design the tabernacle's artistic element. And I always found that interesting that they went into great detail about this is exactly what I want this to look like. And I think that was, again, setting a context of worship for the Israelites. The third is with Solomon's temple. There was a great deal of detail and artistic excellence that went into the building of the temple. And then the final example that I use frequently is that Christ used storytelling through parables to introduce truth to listeners. And so, what a great way to tell a story that points people back to Christ. And that's what the fine arts have done for many, many years.
That's fantastic. That really highlights that. And, the more, since you pointed out, it's like, yeah, I really do see that in there. That's perfect. The Psalms, the design of the tabernacle, Solomon's temple, and the parables, perfect examples. So along those same lines, as we talk about biblical worldview, we also talk about how important it is that we aren't siloing what we do. This is sacred. This is for me. This is ministry. This is sports. But instead, allowing a biblical worldview to just permeate everything we do. This also applies to fine arts. Darren, talk with us about how students can view their creative work really as a form of worship and service to God, and not just a silo in and of itself as fine arts.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, uh, students, when they participate in the fine arts, are reflecting the creative nature of God through their artistic expression. So I think that anything and everything that they do is doing that. But then when you get down to a practical level, I think it's important to include students in your Christian school in the act of worship, maybe in chapel. Each week. So maybe they're helping lead the worship. Maybe they're playing instruments. They're participating in congregational singing, or playing or singing solos. Those are great ways to allow their creative expression to be used for worship. And another way is to allow the students to take their artistic expressions and take it into the community. My high school was very strong on getting the choir to go out into churches, getting the choir to go perform maybe at the mall, something like that, so that we were taking our faith out into the community and being an outreach ministry, being salt and light to the world through fine arts.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I want to loop back around and talk more about the ministry aspect as well, because
Mhm.
I just think that's so, so important. Boy, great memories too. We've both been on those choir trips and things like that. That's just, there's camaraderie there as you minister. Okay, so
Yes,
with this foundation laid, let's talk about the fine arts programs in Christian schools. We've kind of talked about fine arts in general. Let's bring it into the school. I know
sure.
this is a passion of yours. And what I love is that I love that you aren't just content with your own fine arts accomplishments and your own talents, but you want to see Christian schools flourish in the area of fine arts. It's no secret. Fine arts can be daunting, and for some schools, it's invasive in that it just permeates the school. No doubt there are listeners thinking about the resources, the budget, the time commitment, and even the talent needed to do fine arts well. Darren, you've been around a lot of fine arts programs over the years. In your experience, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you think Christian schools are facing as they try to implement a very robust fine arts program?
Let me do a quick flyby, then I'll go back and discuss each one, and then maybe discuss some things that we can do to uh, attack those challenges or overcome those challenges. So the five that I've noticed are funding. Number two, qualified instructors. Number three, curriculum integration. Number four, space and facilities. And then number five, scheduling conflicts. And you mentioned that earlier with sports. But let me go back and talk about each one of those. Fine arts programs are not cheap. They do require a financial investment for instruments, for art supplies, costumes, specialized instructions. All of those things are part of that. And I realize that many Christian schools that rely on tuition, donations, church support often struggle with securing adequate funding for that. So that is
Absolutely.
an issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, second is qualified instructors. Heads of school and teachers need to be careful that we just don't put anyone into a fine arts instruction. So you want to find and you want to retain the qualified arts instructors who are also aligned with the school's Christian values. And I think that's a big challenging part. Is there are great artists out there, but they're not aligned with you, And then there may be people who are aligned with you, but may not be high level artists. So you've got to work through that. The third is the idea of curriculum integration. My Christian high school started in 1968, and when I came, it was about 7 years into it. And if you're not careful, you get the cake baked, and then it's hard to put ingredients in. And I'll talk about that in a
Good way to put
second.
it.
But yeah, how do you integrate that into an already packed curriculum? And schools have to balance their academic requirements with arts education. So that's all a very tricky part. And I do have an idea for that may just get us out of that mindset. Next are space and facilities. Sometimes you've got a stage at the end of the basketball court, and so you're balancing. Well, the team's got to get here and practice. Well, we've got practice. The stage, is in the middle of an acoustic
Yeah.
nightmare with the
Nothing like
gymnasium. Yeah,
Juliet getting hit by a basketball.
exactly. Or and then when, of course, I've been in halls where they don't have a good miking system, and the
Yeah.
sounds just echo in the building during the show. You also Some schools may lack like designated areas for teaching. I can guarantee you that one of the most complicated rooms you're going to have is for art. Art has to have paper and paints and all sorts of things. So sometimes it's just not available. You need music rooms, you need performance spaces. So that's a big issue for many. And then finally, which I think is connected to these, and that is this idea of scheduling conflicts. Rehearsals, performances, exhibitions often require outside time from school, and that's a big commitment on the student's part. Plus, once that 3 o'clock bell rings, they're starting ball practices, and you're wanting to do play practices. So there's a lot going on. So I think if I can just offer a few suggestions for each one of
Yes.
those.
Yes. Let's do it. Let's talk
And I talked
solutions.
earlier about this metaphor that it's adding an ingredient to a cake that's already baked, and you're like, oh, I forgot the baking soda, I'll just sprinkle some baking soda on top of this. That It doesn't work that way. And so sometimes we've got to do a complete restart of the program. Now that's not as scary as you think it
Hmm.
might be.
It sounds scary.
um, yeah, you want to go. You can't fix the cake once it's baked, but the next time I fix that cake, I'm going to get the ingredients out in front of me, and I've got the academics, I've got sports, and I've got fine arts, and I've got to figure out what would it look like? What would an ideal school setting look like with all three of those baked into the cake? And so it's a bit of taking it back down to ground zero. And if you were designing a Christian school and you wanted it to be just really ideal, what would it look like? And so sometimes it's easier to do that and get it back on the table than it is to try to put the ingredient in something that hasn't had it for years. If that makes sense, it just seems like that. So you've got to rethink some of those. So you want to figure out, okay, if we were starting tomorrow and this were uh, our first year of doing this, what would it look like? Well, we definitely want to have athletics, we want to have fine arts, we want to have academics. What percentage? How does that work? Do we have the things running at the same time? Those are the questions that have got to be asked. And of course, one of the main ingredients that always has to be there, and that's that Christian worldview. I tell folks, and this is kind of a side track away from it, but the fine arts at secular schools, colleges, universities, even high schools, I'm surprised at what high schools do sometimes. Um, the arts can represent a shift from a Christian worldview more than just about anything. Sports, maybe not so much. Academics, everyone's got to know math and all of those things, but really the fine arts can take it downhill very fast. So I caution folks who are sending their child off to a secular environment to be very careful, and that would go for teachers and guidance counselors, all the things that are working. So sorry, a little sidetrack there, but
Oh, it's great. So
Yeah, look,
true.
and I'll come back and just talk about a couple of each of the things
Yeah,
that I
sure.
mentioned before. Funding, I have found schools often do local sponsorships or dinner theater opportunities, parental giving to help support the efforts. Um, uh, Many schools will do a playbill, and they'll do a playbill that has everything in this book of advertisements, and then they'll just insert whatever program they're happening to do. So maybe the choir concert gets inserted into this larger playbill. Well, the playbill is full of advertisements from local sponsorships, and I think that's a great way of raising funds to help offset some of the needs of the school. In terms of instructors, I say just make sure you understand what the qualifications of a good arts teacher is going to be. Know what those academic credentials are needed. If you're getting an art teacher, they need to either have some type of background in art education, which would be ideal, or studio art. If a person were coming to me with that, I would say, would you mind just teaching maybe a sample lesson for us during the interview process? To come in and do that for us, just to make sure they have the academic credentials. Some people are like, well, anybody can teach art, so we'll just,
Oh,
you know,
no.
well, it would be like my assigning a fine arts person to teach PE or a fine arts person to teach Bible. I would feel a bit uncomfortable if my child were being taught by someone who had not had the proper training in the area where they were going. So that's something. Curriculum, I think I would do an audit of your curriculum to uncover new ways of integrating arts into what you teach. I was part of a national grant many years ago, and I was on the local board that was handling the grant. And they said, we're going to give the state of South Carolina a large amount of money, but we want to see you integrate arts back into the curriculum. If you remember back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, as budgets got cut, the very first thing that got cut was what? The
Fine
arts.
arts.
It's
Yeah,
like, it's too expensive. We can't do this anymore.
right. It's an
And
extra.
yeah, exactly. And what the grant had suggested was, as you cut the arts, the students' um, achievement tests and standardized testing scores went down. So there was a strong correlation between the two. So as they removed arts to save money, their kids' scores went down right with it. So I remind folks that integrating the arts back into the school system is going to help you with that. So we actually tracked it. And sure enough, as we integrated the arts back into the classroom, their scores went up. And some of these were Title I schools that were coming at some very hard. It was very hard to get the test scores that they were needing, but the arts actually helped them out. So as you're doing an audit of your organization, you want to cover up or uncover, new ways of integrating the arts into what you teach. Space and facilities, I just say, just if much as you can, have designated spaces for art, music, and theater instruction. It's not always possible, but if you're building a new building, make sure that those spaces are available. Then the other thing that sometimes we don't think is, we may have a small stage in the gymnasium, but it may not be ideal for theatrical productions. Many of the schools that I've worked with are actually looking into town for places to rent to do their productions. It's a great idea, and so you'll rehearse the space in a different location for a while, and then maybe the last week or last 2 weeks, you'll take everything you've done and take it to the local space, and that's a great way of
Oh, yeah.
again taking what you're doing in the arts out into the community,
Oh, sure.
and maybe churches, a lot of different places that can do that. Finally, with the scheduling conflicts, and Jenny, you'll remember this when we worked together, we would
I'm
often,
waiting for this great answer.
yeah, well, it's tricky, but the
It's
main
never
thing that
ending.
helped me was to get all the parties around the table the
Yes.
year before and do a calendar meeting. So we would all have a year calendar in front of us, and we would start with the big rock. So, okay, graduation is going to be here. We need the big sports state competitions are here. We want the play here, and once we got those big rocks in, then we would start filling in some of the necessary technical rehearsals and all of that. So we would get it all on paper, and then we would get buy-in from each of the groups that this was working for them, and then we stuck to the calendar. And I think sometimes we're working on scheduling conflicts the week of something, and it's so difficult. But if the sports folks and the fine arts folks have been around the table and they're all talking, then I think it works much better. Then we have to do a give and take. Sometimes a coach may come to me and say, Darren, we had an unexpected practice come up. Is there any way you can work with me today? I might say, sure. But then guess what? Next week, I might have to go to him and say, I am going to have so-and-so for this rehearsal. I also made it clear, Jenny, that the 2 weeks before we opened up a big show, there were zero conflicts. In other words, I could
totally
not.
Protected.
Exactly. And so everyone knew that ahead of time. So those are just some things to kind of think about when you're working through some of these challenges. But I've seen enough schools that are working through it successfully to say it is possible. So I hope I didn't overwhelm anybody with like, oh my goodness, how do we do this?
Great.
It is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love those practical suggestions because that's how we can come up with the challenges. It's just coming up with the solutions. That's always the tricky part. Yeah, incredibly insightful. Okay, so I want to springboard off of that and talk about the benefits of fine arts to students. Seriously, sure. I mean, why would we go to all this work and all this expense? I would also like to pick your brain about trends and even some Christian role models in the arts, which, are sometimes hard to find. But we're tight on time, so we're going to pick up there for part 2. Listeners, we're signing off for now, but be sure to catch part 2 because this conversation is nowhere near done. Darren, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to picking this back up in part 2.
Sounds great, Jenny. Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for joining us today. I hope you were challenged and encouraged in the area of fine arts. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about the show and to submit questions for our upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and go follow us on social media. Now it's time to get back to your day. It's not just any day, though, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power, but also through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.